mother heard her 6-year-old son let go of a blood-curdling scream and immediately ran up the stairs into the bedroom, only to find the young man there on a bed with his little 2-year-old sister who had him by his hair, pulling it. So the mother came and got the baby to stop, and she said, "Honey, you need to understand that she does not know that hurts you." So the mother went back downstairs to continue doing the laundry, and she hears the daughter let out a blood-curdling scream. And she runs back to the bedroom, and the son says, "She knows now." Sometimes it's natural to want to have vengeance upon our enemies, or at least it seems natural. And this is why, even again, we need to understand that Jesus is calling us to a very high standard of loving your enemies. Loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you. Jesus establishes a law that is higher than the law of Moses. The very fact that we're now in the last of the 6 antitheses of Jesus. In other words, he says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And he's given us not just the letter of the law by which we can get by, but the heart of the law, which is radical love. And these things are very difficult to wrap our head around. So difficult to wrap around our head that, the philosophers of the modern age have struggled with them. Soren Kierkegaard, famous existentialist, said that, well, this is really kind of hyperbolic. He's setting the standard high. Kind of like how sometimes you set the clock ahead an hour to make sure that you arrive early to things instead of late. Sigmund Freud said that we don't want to love our neighbor. That in fact, the whole doctrine of loving your neighbor suppresses the id and the ego and causes trouble for human beings. And even in our own day, I think we really struggle with this doctrine. But here's what's funny is I find again, I want to make this clear because as we heard, our first reading was from Leviticus. So sometimes people say, well, Jesus came and he came to destroy all the laws and all the rules of Leviticus. And that's not true at all. Jesus fulfilled the ceremonial laws of the Old Testament. So things like what we should eat, what we should drink, what we should wear, those things have been changed. But the morality never passes away. God's moral law does not change because God does not change. I said it last week, but it's important to say again because so many people are waiting for the teachings of the church to change. When's the church going to dial it back? And you know what it's always about? You guys know what it's always about, right? Sex. Okay, and I get it. Like, we live in a society that has a different view towards sexuality that's counter to the gospel of God. But here's the thing. I don't ever hear anyone say, the church really needs to dial it back on this love your enemies thing. Has anyone ever really said that? We need to really dial it back on this love thy neighbor thing. It's really an impossible standard to hold, so let's just forget about it altogether. And I don't know about you guys, but I have a lot more difficulty loving my neighbor than being obedient to the church on the other stuff, And so just because the standard is difficult doesn't mean that we forget it or that we abandon it altogether. Now, Jesus is, in a lot of ways, using hyperbolic language in the gospel today. It's important to understand that. Christians aren't called to an absolute radical pacifism. What I mean by this is you literally don't have to sit and let yourself be killed by someone else. That's not the gospel. You don't have to allow your house to be robbed. But there's a beautiful story told of an Egyptian monk who returned from prayer into the cell to find a thief taking all of his stuff. And then what he went to do is he took the rest of his stuff that was there and helped load it on the thief's mule and let him go off with it. But some of you might recall one of my favorite literary and theater pieces of all time, Les Miserables, right, by Victor Hugo. Many of you maybe seen the movies. There's lots different. The musical, I love the musical. It's one of my favorites. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. But there's a beautiful scene when Jean Valjean, who's a prisoner, is received by the bishop of the town, and in the middle of the night, he steals the bishop's silver and runs away, and he's apprehended by the guards who recognize the bishop's crest on the silver. And they bring him to the bishop's house, and the bishop in turn looks at him and grabs the silver candlesticks off the altar and says, "You forgot to take these as well." In other words, these are two stories about human beings that were so detached from their possessions that they saw the opportunity to love the neighbor as being more important than silver candlesticks. And the bishop, of course, gives Jean Valjean this beautiful speech about, now you must use the gift I've given you to become an honest man. And he does. He actually becomes a very, very good man from that point on. Why? Because someone showed him love. Someone showed him compassion. Someone showed him mercy when the world wouldn't show him any. We live in a society, my brothers and sisters, right now that is so divided, and we get so upset. I mean, I value, there are several relationships I have. I have friends that are very different. I have friends that are gay. I have friends that have different political views than I do. I have friends that aren't living according to the moral teachings of the church, and I really value those relationships that I have with people where I can sit down and argue with them, right? And then go and shake hands and call it a day. I think we've lost that in society. We can't argue. We can't debate objectively anymore. Everyone gets so upset. But what if we spent all this time that we do getting upset at people who are different than us? And we do it all the time, I know, because I hear you. I hear you. You guys come in here. People say to me all the time, "Father, I'm just so angry because I watch the news and I see da 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 da." And I hear both sides of it, by the way. What if we spent as much time trying to love our enemies and pray for our enemies as we do finding things to be aggravated about? Now, I get it. I fall into this stuff too. Like, they say every time you point a finger, there's three pointing back to you. I'm preaching to myself. It's so easy to villainize people that are on the other side of things. So someone says, "Well, how do you do it?" Well, I said, when you start getting angry, pray. Begin to offer prayers for that person. And here's what's beautiful. If you don't have words for those prayers, and sometimes we don't, that's why we have these beautiful prayers that the church and our tradition has given us. Say an Our Father for that person. Say a Hail Mary for that person. Ask God to bless that person. And who knows, maybe that person will have a conversion. Maybe that person doesn't need the conversion. Maybe I'm the one that needs the conversion. Let's let God figure it out. But let's spend more time praying for people who give us trouble than being angry with them. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was actually a provision of justice at the time of Moses. It was considered it was a juridical thing. So basically, if someone took something from you, the punishment was equal to what they took. And if you think about it, even that sounds unfair. Why should the person who committed an act of injustice against an innocent victim have the same punishment as the innocent victim? Shouldn't they have more punishment? Shouldn't they be put to death for putting out someone's eye instead of just having their own eye plucked out? So Moses was even giving a provision of mercy. And now Jesus, as the new Moses, says we should be willing to offer God's mercy to anyone. Now notice that nowhere in there does Jesus say, if someone's killing you, fall on a sword. He doesn't say that. So we do have an opportunity to defend human life. But Jesus is telling us that our mercy should be radical. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. It's time to stop being so angry all the time. Jesus doesn't ever say, "Blessed are the angry." Now, there's a time and a place for righteous indignation. Jesus himself had it several times. We know the one famous scene in the temple in Jerusalem where Jesus, turns over the tables and makes a whip out of cords. There's several times where Jesus absolutely goes off on the Pharisees, and it says he looked at them with anger. There are times when righteous indignation is okay. And Thomas Aquinas says that the good indicator is if your anger moves you to be able to do something. But if your anger doesn't move you to correct injustice, then your anger is just passion and useless. And all it's going to do is fester inside of us. Friends, try forgiving people. I know that sounds crazy, but I once heard an African proverb that said that resentment is like taking poison and expecting someone else to die. It's like Bert and Ernie would tell me on Sesame Street, right? When you're mad at someone, you're only hurting yourself. And we grew up and we've heard that our whole lives, but I got to tell you, I found it to be true. Not only should we forgive people because it's what Jesus tells us to do, because it's the right thing to do, the correct thing to do, and the virtuous thing to do, but it also is true that I'm the only one that's being hurt by my own resentment. If you're resenting someone, chances are they don't even know about it. And maybe we're not even hurting them, but we're really giving the evil one a stronghold in our life. It's time to let go. As we begin to enter into, as we do, this Wednesday, into the beautiful season of Lent, where we go in the desert with the Lord for 40 days, who am I mad at? Who is my neighbor that I'm not loving? Who is the enemy that I'm not praying for? Who is the one to whom I owe a coat or a shirt that I've not given it to? Am I being an instrument of God's mercy and justice, or am I simply serving my own needs? These are questions we should be asking ourselves right now today as we celebrate this Eucharist, for it is here that we receive the strength from God Almighty to do what He has called us to do in order that we may enter into His kingdom, which alone has no end.